We begin with the Prime Minister's phone conversation with Ukraine's president today. We know it took place a short while ago and have some details courtesy of Volodymyr Zelensky's Twitter account. He says, quote, spoke to Justin Trudeau, thanked for the continued powerful defense support, and reiterated that the international position on sanctions must be principled. After the terrorist attacks in various locations, the pressure must be increased, not decreased. We'll bring you the readout of the conversation once it's released by the Prime Minister's office. Well, today's call comes in the wake of Ottawa's recent decision to return turbines used in a pipeline that carries natural gas from Russia to Germany. Ukraine views the return of the turbines as a breach of sanctions. Earlier this week, Trudeau defended his government's decision.
This was a very difficult decision. But we have seen Russia consistently trying to weaponize energy. The sanctions that Canada's leading on, that we continue to push harder and harder, are aimed at Putin and his enablers and aren't designed to harm our allies and their populations.
The turbines, which had been sent to Montreal for scheduled repairs, were caught up in the economic sanctions Canada imposed on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine views it as a means for Vladimir Putin to fund his war chest. The Ukrainian World Congress, which represents the diaspora, is seeking a judicial review of the waiver in federal court. Ottawa says the move is simply to protect an ally's energy supply. For more on this story, I spoke with Daniel Bilek. He's a Canadian-Ukrainian who's part of an effort to stop the turbine transfer. His key message, it helps Russia fund its war and puts lives in danger. But the federal government says we need to support our German allies while maintaining public support for Ukraine. Earlier, I asked Bilek to respond to Canada's justification for waiving these sanctions.
I have difficulty with the idea that sanctions only affect are designed only to affect Russia. Of course, they're supposed to affect Russia, but obviously there are going to be inconveniences for the countries that put the sanctions on. Yes, there are hard decisions. I'm going to have hard decisions. I'm going to have to put on an extra sweater, turn down the thermostat, find out where I'm going to get wood to heat my house, and find out where I'm going to get gas to keep the furnace running this winter. I also have hard decisions about whether do I send my wife to work into the city tomorrow, because is there going to be a guided missile that's going to come through her building? Do I cross the street or not cross the street because I'm going to get bombed? And these are the hard decisions that we have to make. We buried a 4-year-old child today in Vinnytsia, little Lisa, a child with Down syndrome who was killed at a crosswalk, pushing her pram to her speech therapist who was teaching her how to speak. This girl was killed. Her mother was eviscerated, is barely hanging on. And, they have hard decisions to make as well. These decisions are always going to be difficult. And sometimes people are going to be inconvenienced. Unfortunately, the Germans are paying for at least the last 8 years of an awful policy that the German government has pursued. And I understand that we need to try to keep the Germans on board, etc. But I really think, and I really hope that the populations in Germany, in Canada, in the United States are going to understand that they need to stick with Ukraine, because if we don't end this war soon, we are going to be dragging it out. It's going to be painful for everybody. Everybody is affected by this war, and we have to be in it to win it. If we get the weapons that President Zelenskyy is asking for, if we get $60 billion a year, that shouldn't be a big deal for our allies to keep our economy afloat until we can end this war. And if we get the sanctions are kept in place and ironclad, and the sanctity of those sanctions are maintained, the defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, said the other day, we can be done by winter. We'll push these guys out. We have to push them out. Otherwise, if they stay in Ukraine, if we have a messy stalemate, they're coming after NATO. And that means Canadian troops and Canadian men and women are going to die in Poland and the Baltic states. We got to finish this now. And the only way to do that is to degrade Putin's war machine.
And that was lawyer Daniel Bilek from Kyiv. Well, for Germany, the return of the turbines can't come soon enough. The country is heavily dependent on Russian natural gas. And with fears of a winter cutoff, Germany is already rationing energy to reduce consumption. CBC's Rebecca Collard has more from Berlin.
What Russia has been saying over the last few months when they were cutting the gas supplies to Germany is that part of the reason that they had to do that was because these turbines needed to be returned, and that would allow them to increase the flow of fuel to Germany. Now, as this decision was made, we were told that, in fact, actually Nord Stream 2, which is the pipeline that uses these turbines, was being shut down for 10 days because of some sort of maintenance. And German officials have said that, they do know that they were warned in advance that this maintenance needed to take place, but that, nobody really believed that the reason that gas was not flowing to Germany was because of these turbines. Now, that gas has been cut off, and we're waiting here in Germany to find out on July 21st whether or not the gas will be turned back on. Now, if it's not turned back on with or without these turbines, Germany is in a very difficult position. What Germany is facing, and German politicians have called it a economic confrontation with Russia. It's nothing compared to what Ukrainians are facing on the battlefield against this Russian invasion. However, I think it's also important to understand that it's not just about turning down the heat to 17 degrees here. Germany is Germany is the EU's largest economy, and the backbone of this economy, Hillary, is very much industry, and that industry is dependent on fuel. And I'll just say that industry has been very much dependent on Russian fuel. And part of that is because, for decades, Germany had this policy called Ostpolitik, which was essentially the Eastern policy. And there was an idea that they would integrate with economies in the post-Soviet states, in the Soviet states, and with Moscow, and that was going to allow Germany to affect the policies of those countries. And that clearly hasn't worked. Instead, what we've seen is this difficult position that Germany and other EU states are in. So, the situation is quite difficult here, and going to winter is going to be a lot more difficult, Hillary.
CBC's Rebecca Collard for us in Berlin.